news would alert him. After that announcement, he went to bed early, keeping his normal routine. Alex and Daniel stayed up to watch the evening news. He curled around her on the sofa so naturally that it didn't feel out of the ordinary at all. She couldn't remember feeling so physically comfortable with anyone in all her life. Even her mother had been a brittle hugger, someone who rarely expressed affection, in words or actions. Alex's closeness with Barnaby was verbal, never physical. So she thought that she should feel awkward and embarrassed with her legs draped across another person's lap. Her head cradled against that person's shoulder while his arms were wrapped around her. But she felt only oddly relaxed, as if his proximity somehow removed a portion of the stress from the situation. The Daniel piece played again, but it ran later in the program than before, and she could tell the night anchor was bored by the story. The agency might be able to force this bit into the news for a short time, but they couldn't keep the networks from reacting to what a non-story it was. Of course, there was the obvious second act. "I should probably warn you, if you haven't thought of it already," she said. He tried to sound glib, but she could hear the wariness. "I'm sure I haven't." "Well, if this story doesn't get results quickly, they'll have to up the ante to keep the press working for them." "What does that mean, up the ante?" She leaned back so she could see his face, her nose wrinkling in distaste at what she had to say. "They'll make the story more salacious somehow. Say you're suspected of a crime. Invent a student who you abducted or abused.
You're on the green.
Something along those lines, probably. They could be more creative, though." His eyes shifted from her face back to the television screen, though the announcer had moved on to early primary predictions. He flushed, then went pale. She let him take his time with the idea. She could imagine how hard it would be for a good man to realize he was about to become a villain. "There's nothing I can do about it," he said quietly. It was not quite a question. "No." "At least my parents aren't around to see it. Maybe. I don't think all my friends will believe it." "I wouldn't," she agreed. He smiled down at her. "At one point in the not-too-distant past, you thought I was going to murder a couple million people. I didn't know you then." "True." When the late news was done, they engaged in a more subdued goodnight. Then she began the cleanup. They might have to leave quickly. She dismantled and stowed her lab, then changed into leggings and a black t-shirt. Things she would be comfortable in if tonight was the night they had to run. She knew she was tired, but her brain couldn't seem to slow down. She didn't want to miss anything else. Daniel might be right. Perhaps her first big mistakes were actually good things and that they might have saved his life. But she couldn't afford any more errors. It wasn't just her own life at stake now. She sighed to herself. There were benefits to having a liability, but the load was definitely much heavier. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts.
Pretty deep stuff.
"Don't open
here.
the door," she cautioned
give it a good
quickly,
hack.
jerking upright.
In the right direction.
The cot rocked underneath her. After a short pause, Daniel asked, "Are you wearing a gas mask?" "Yes." "I thought so. Your voice sounds muffled." Another pause. "Is your security system terribly difficult to disarm?" he wondered. "Give me a minute." It took less than that to secure the live wires. She pushed her mask back onto the top of her head and opened the door. He was leaning against the frame. She couldn't see him perfectly in the darkness, but she thought he looked tired and sad. "You're very worried."
Great contact. Nice
he
swing.
inferred, reaching to touch her mask lightly. "Actually, I always sleep with this. It feels weird if I don't have it on."
Well, I'm just
Is
glad to
something
be
wrong?
out of the deep stuff.
"More than
This is
everything?"
good.
"No, I was just lonely. I couldn't sleep. I wanted to be with you." He hesitated. "Can I come in?" Okay." She took a step back, switching the light on. He looked around, a new expression taking over. "This is the room Kevin gave you? Why didn't you say something? You should have my room." "I'm fine here," she assured him. "I'm not much for beds anyway. It's safer to sleep light."
This one's looking good.
"I don't know what to say. I can't sleep in a king-size bed knowing you're stuck in a storage box." "Really, I like it." He gave her a doubtful look, which turned suddenly sheepish. I was going to invite myself in, but there's barely room for you. We could shift some crates. I have a better idea. Come with me. He offered his hand. She took it without considering what she was doing. He pulled her down the dark hall, past the bathroom door, to his own room. The only light came from a small lamp on the bedside table. It was a very nice room,
Yes.
more in line with Kevin's usual aesthetic than her own storage
Two
space.
under for the round.
There was a massive bed in the middle of the room, covered in a white comforter, with a rustic four-poster frame made
Okay,
of
let's
artfully
put this ball
unfinished
out
logs.
there.
A gold blanket that matched the tone of the wood was draped over the foot of the bed. You see? He said. There's no way I could sleep in here again after seeing your sad situation. I'd feel like a horrible excuse for a man. Well, I'm not trading. I already have my room wired. They stood awkwardly in the doorway for a moment. I didn't really have anything specific in mind to talk about. I just wanted to be where you were.
Solid swing.
It's okay. I wasn't sleeping either. Let's not sleep together, he said. Then he flushed and laughed embarrassedly. That didn't sound right at all.
Okay,
He
you're
pulled
about
her hand again
140 yards
toward the
out
big
here.
bed. Look, I promise to be a perfect gentleman, he said. I'll just feel less anxious if I can see you. She climbed up on the thick white comforter next to him, laughing with him at his awkwardness and wondering privately if she wanted him to be a perfect gentleman. She reminded herself sternly that this was not the appropriate time for those kinds of thoughts. Maybe someday in the future when
Nice.
their lives weren't in danger, if that day ever came. He took her hand, but otherwise gave her space. They both lay back on the stacks of feather pillows.
For the
He put his
birdie
free
here.
hand behind his head and looked over at her. Yes, see? This is better. And it was. It didn't make sense. She was out of her secured room and farther from her other weapons, but paradoxically, she felt safer. Yes, she agreed. She slipped the gas mask off her head and laid it beside her. Your hand is cold. Before she could respond, he sat up and grabbed the blanket from the foot of the bed. He shook it out, then settled it over them. When he lay back, he was closer to her. His shoulder touched hers, and his arm lay over hers as he took her hand again. Why was she so vividly aware of things that, in the grand scheme
And
of
that'll
survival,
keep you at
didn't
2
really
under
matter?
for the round. All right, let's let her rip.
Thanks, she said. Don't take this the wrong way. I mean it as the highest compliment and not as a slight to your company, but I think I might actually be able to sleep with you here. I know what you mean. It's been a long day. Yes, he agreed fervently. Are you comfortable? I am. Don't take this the wrong way, but I might put my mask back on at some point. It's just a weird sleep habit. He smiled. Like hugging a teddy bear. Exactly like that, only not adorable. He rolled toward her and leaned his forehead against her temple. She could feel his eyelashes brush against her cheek as he closed his eyes. His right arm snaked around her waist. I think you're adorable, he breathed.
Beauty.
His voice sounded like he was already half asleep. And terrifyingly lethal, too, of course. He yawned. Very sweet, she said.
Okay, we're putting
But she
from
wasn't
around
sure if he heard her.
15 feet out.
He was breathing so evenly she thought he might already be out. She waited a few moments, and then, carefully, she reached up with her free hand to touch his curls. They were so soft. Her fingers traced his features, totally calm in unconsciousness. It was that same innocent, serene face that had never belonged in her world. She didn't think she'd ever seen anything quite so beautiful. She fell asleep like that, with her hand tucked possessively around the nape of his neck, the gas mask forgotten behind her back.
Nice.
Chapter 17. Kevin didn't call.
3 under for the round.
Daniel didn't seem to think this was odd, but Alex thought she detected some extra strain in Arnie's shoulders.
Okay, 5th hole coming
It
up.
was too long. As she'd understood things, Kevin only had to get into a position from which he could follow the one person they knew for certain was involved, Karsten. He could have made the drive to D.C. in 2 days, even taking it easy. She'd told him exactly where to find her old boss once he was there. It was only a few hours' work at most. If Karsten wasn't where he was supposed to be, Kevin should have called. What was he doing? Or had something happened to him? How long should she wait before suggesting that possibility to Daniel? On the plus side, every hour hidden helped her face. Under low wattage lighting and with a lot of makeup, she might be able to escape notice for 3 or even 4 seconds. The wait was an odd mix of boredom, stress, and the strangest kind of happiness.
Yeah, I stand corrected.
Doomed happiness.
It's the deep stuff
Happiness
for you.
with a deadline, but that didn't make it less all-encompassing. She should be in a very dark place right now, the pulsing beat of the hunt filling her ears, but she found herself smiling as a default expression. It didn't help that Daniel was just as inappropriately giddy as she was. They talked about it the next afternoon while watching the afternoon news. Alex had snuck Lola inside when Arnie left to go train with the other animals. She felt bad that they had to keep the door closed on the dogs. It seemed rude. And Einstein and Kahn had come with her, which made the room awkwardly full of dog. She hoped Arnie wouldn't be upset. The dogs must come in sometimes or there wouldn't be the doggy door in the laundry room. She didn't know if the dogs were usually kept outside as part of their training or as an early alarm system or because Arnie had allergies, though if it was the last option, he'd chosen the wrong lifestyle.
Or so to the pin here.
Lola parked her floppy jowls and ears on Alex's thigh, where there would shortly be a drool situation, Alex was sure. Einstein jumped right up on the couch beside Daniel, tail waving enthusiastically at the rule breaking. Kahn turned himself into a long ottoman in front of the couch. After the program's dull opening story, focused on politics, naturally, as if there weren't almost a year to go before anything actually happened, Daniel stretched his long legs out across Kahn's back. Kahn didn't seem to mind. Alex stroked Lola's ears, and Lola's tail thumped against the floor.
This is for Birdie.
It all felt comfortable and familiar, though she'd never been in a position like this in her entire life. She'd never been so closely surrounded by living things, touching them, hearing their breathing, let alone holding hands with a man who thought she was adorable and lethal. That he could know her full story and still be able to look at her the way he did. Her eyes moved automatically to his face while the thought ran through her mind, and she found him looking at her, too. He smiled his wide, bright grin, the 2 days' stubble making him look unexpectedly rugged, and she smiled back without thinking about it. All kinds of bubbly emotions percolated through her chest, and she realized it was probably the best feeling she'd ever known. She sighed, then groaned.
Coming off
he glanced at the TV for a reason.
Let's see what happens
but
here.
It was just a commercial. What is it? I feel goofy, she admitted. Stupid, bubbly. Why does everything seem so positive? I can't string logical thoughts together. I try to worry, and I end up smiling. I might be losing my mind, and I don't care about that nearly as much as I should. I want to punch myself, but my face is finally just starting to heal. Daniel laughed. That's one of the drawbacks of falling in love, I think. Stomach tingles again. Is that what you think we're doing? Feels like it to me.
Nice.
She frowned.
And
I don't have any comparisons.
I'd say
what if I'm
140-ish
actually
yards
going
from
insane?
Here.
You are most definitely sane. But I don't believe people can fall in love so quickly. Truthfully, she didn't entirely believe in love, romantic love, at all. Chemical responses, sure. Sexual attraction, yes. Compatibility, yes. Friendship, loyalty and responsibility, but love just seemed a little too much of a fairy tale.
Now that was a swing.
Well, I never used to. I mean, I always believed in attraction at first sight. I've experienced that, and that's definitely
All
a
right,
part
you're
of what's
putting
happening
now.
for
I'm
me
thinking
now.
two-putt. And
He
for the
grinned
bird.
again. But love at first sight? Just fantasy. Oh, sure. Of course it is. Except. There's no except, Daniel. Except that something happened to me on that train. Something totally outside of my experience or ability to explain. She didn't know what to say. She glanced at the TV just as the newscast's ending theme began to play. That caught Daniel's attention, too. Did we miss it? No, it didn't run. And that's not a good thing, he assumed, an edge creeping into his
that'll
voice.
keep you at 3 under
I
for
can
the
think
round.
of a couple different things it could mean. One, they pushed the story out,
Okay,
and when it
it's
didn't
time
get
to send
results,
this
they had
ball
to
on
let it
its
die.
way.
Two, the story is about to change. Daniel's shoulders squared defensively. How soon do you think we'll see the next version? Very soon, if that's what's happening. There was a third possibility, but she wasn't ready to say it aloud. The story would definitely disappear if they'd gotten what they needed from it. If they had Kevin now. She thought she understood enough about Kevin's character to be fairly certain that he wouldn't give them up easily. He was smart enough to go with the most believable version of the story if the department caught him. He'd been too late to save Daniel, and after killing the Oleander, he'd gone to DC for revenge. He'd be able to stick to that story for a while, she hoped. She didn't know who they had doing interrogations now. If that person was any good, well, eventually Kevin would tell the truth. As
Good
much
stuff.
as she wasn't Kevin's
10-footer
biggest
here. This is
fan,
makeable.
she felt sick for him now. Of course, he could have been prepared for capture, the way she would have been. He could be dead already. Batcave or no Batcave, if Kevin didn't call by midnight, it would be time to leave. She could feel when she was pushing her luck. Well, all the happy feelings had subsided. At least, that was a sign that she wasn't totally crazy. Yet. They shooed the dogs out on the porch before Arnie was due to come back.
Yes.
Though the animal smell would probably give them away regardless. Daniel
4
started a
under
meat
for the
sauce for
round.
spaghetti, and she helped with the simple parts, opening cans, measuring spices.
So
It
a nice
was
drive out
effortless
on this
and
one.
companionable, working side by side, like they'd been doing this for years. Was that the feeling Daniel was talking about? The strange ease of their togetherness. Though she didn't believe his theory, she had to admit to herself that she had no explanation of her own. Daniel hummed as he worked, a familiar-sounding tune that she couldn't place at first. She caught herself humming along a few minutes later, without seeming to realize he was doing it.
Well, I guess you can't hit
Daniel
all the
started to
fairways.
sing the words. Guilty feet have got no rhythm, he sang. Isn't that song older than
Pretty
you are?
deep, rough
She
here.
asked after a moment.
I'm not going to
He
sugarcoat it.
seemed surprised. Oh, was I singing that out loud? Sorry, I tend to do that when I cook if I don't keep a strict hold on myself. How do you even know the words? I'll have you know that to this day, Careless Whisper remains a very popular song on the karaoke circuit. I kill it on 80s night. You're into karaoke? Hey, who says school teachers don't know how to party? He stepped away from the stove, sauce-covered spoon still in his right hand, and pulled her into a loose embrace with his left. He danced her once around a small circle, pressing his rough cheek against hers while singing, "Pain is all you'll find." Then he turned back to the stove, dancing in place while he sang cheerfully about how he was never going to dance again. Don't be an idiot, her mind told her as the goofy smile stretched across her face again. Shut up, her body responded. Daniel didn't have a voice that belonged on the air, but it was a pleasant, light tenor, and he made up for any deficiencies with his enthusiasm. By the time they heard the dogs greet Arnie at the door, they were in the middle of a passionate duet of Total Eclipse of the Heart. Alex quit singing immediately, her face flushing, but Daniel seemed oblivious both to her cowardice and to Arnie's entrance.
Could be in the rough here.
I really need you tonight,
Well, this is in
he
the
belted
inner
out as Arnie
sanctum of
came
the
through
rough
the door,
here. This is deep
shaking
down
his
in.
head.
You're going to have to handle
It
this
made
with care.
Alex wonder if Kevin was ever any fun or if it was just business all the time when he and Arnie were here alone. Arnie didn't comment, just shut the screen door behind him, letting the fresh, warm air mix with the smells of garlic, onion, and tomato. Now that it was dark outside and light inside, she'd have to make sure he closed the exterior door before she or Daniel went into the part of the room that would be visible to anyone watching. "Anything from the dogs?" she asked Arnie.
"Nope. You would have heard them if they found anything."
She frowned. The story didn't run. Alex and Arnie exchanged a look. Arnie's eyes cut to Daniel's back, then returned to her. She knew what he was asking, and she shook her head no. No, she hadn't talked to Daniel about Kevin and what his silence could mean. Arnie's eyes did that subtle tightening thing that seemed to be his only physical tell
okay,
for stress.
11-footer here. This is
For
definitely makeable.
Arnie's sake, they'd have to get out as soon as possible. If anyone connected Daniel and Alex to this house, it would put Arnie in danger. She hoped he would understand about the truck. Dinner was subdued. Even Daniel seemed to catch the mood. She decided she would tell him her fears about Kevin as soon as they were alone. It would be nice to allow him one more night of decent sleep, but they should probably leave before first light. After they were finished, and not a noodle had survived, Arnie would miss this part of having
Great
house
pot,
guests,
and
at
that
least.
is for par.
She helped clear while Arnie went to turn on the news.
And that'll keep you at
The story
4 under
lineup
for
was
the round.
repetitively familiar. She felt like she could recite along with the anchor woman word for word.
9th hole coming up.
Arnie hadn't already watched 3 rounds today. He settled into the couch. Alex rinsed the plates and handed them to Daniel to load. One of the dogs whined through the screen door, probably Lola. Alex hoped she hadn't spoiled them too much this afternoon. She'd never thought she was a dog person, but she realized she was going to miss the warm and friendly inclusion of the pack. Maybe someday, if Kevin was somehow still alive and well and the plan was operable after all, she might get herself a dog. If all the happy thoughts were real, maybe Kevin would even sell her Lola. It probably wasn't a practical... A low, fast thud interrupted her thoughts. It was a sound that didn't belong. Even as her eyes were moving toward Daniel, looking for a dropped utensil or a slammed cupboard that would explain the noise, her mind was leaping ahead. Before her body had realigned with her brain, a huge bang cry erupted from the porch, along with a vicious growling. Another thud, quieter beside the hullabaloo of the dogs, and the bang broke off into a shocked and pained yelp. She tackled Daniel to the ground while he was still turning toward the door. He outweighed her by a lot, but he was off balance and went down easy. "Shh," she hissed fiercely in his ear. Then she crawled over him to the edge of the island and peered around. She couldn't see Arnie. She looked at the screen door. A small, round hole was torn through the center of the top panel. She tried to listen over the sound of the dogs and the TV, but she couldn't hear any sound from where Arnie should be. It had to be a distance shot, or the dogs would have seen it coming. "Arnie!" she hoarsely whisper-shouted. There was no response. She slithered to the dining room table, where her backpack was propped against the leg of the chair she'd used. She ripped her PPK out of its Ziploc bag, then slid it across the floor to Daniel. She needed both hands. Daniel snagged the gun when it was halfway to the island and leaned around the edge. He hadn't practiced with a handgun, but at this distance, that wouldn't matter terribly much. She shoved her rings on and flung the belt around her waist. Daniel was on his feet in a fraction of a second, bracing his elbows on top of the counter.
Very solid
He didn't look at all
after 9.
conflicted about his ability to fire. She scuttled to the nearby wall where the dining room jutted out from the great room. As she moved, she saw a hand shoving the handle down. But it wasn't a hand. It was a black, furry paw. So Kevin had chosen not to go with the standard round doorknob for more reasons than aesthetics. She breathed again as Einstein burst into the room, Khan and the Rottweiler close on his heels. She could hear Lola panting pained cries outside, and her teeth ground together. While the dogs congregated silently around Daniel, forming a furry shield, she got her fighting shoes on and shoved the garrote wire into one pocket, the wooden handles into the other. "Give the command," she whispered to Daniel. The shooter would be running in now. though he would have to be on the lookout for the dogs. If he had the option, he'd switch the distance rifle for something that made bigger holes. Dogs like these would keep
we're right
coming
around
through a lot of hurt.
165 yards out.
Escape protocol? Daniel whispered uncertainly. Einstein's ears quivered. He gave a quiet cough of a bark, then trotted to the far end of the kitchen and whined. Follow him, Alex instructed Daniel. She darted across the space between the wall and the island, keeping herself in a low crouch. Daniel started to straighten, but before she could say anything, Einstein hurtled over and caught Daniel's hand in his mouth. He yanked Daniel back to the ground. Keep low, she translated in a whisper. Einstein led them toward the laundry room, as Alex had expected, with Khan and the Rottweiler bringing up the rear. As she ducked from the great room to the darkened hallway, she tried to see Arnie. She could see only one hand at first, unmoving, but then she spied splatter against the far wall. It was obvious that there was brain matter mixed in with the blood, so there was no point in trying to drag him with them. It was too late for Arnie, and the shooter was obviously a marksman. The good news just kept coming. Alex was surprised when Einstein stopped short of the laundry room and pawed at a closet in the hall. Daniel pulled the door open, and Einstein jumped past him and tugged at something inside. Alex crept closer just as a weighty pile of fur fell out on top of her. What is this? Daniel breathed in her ear. She felt her way through the pile. I think it's a fur coat, but there's something else. It's too heavy. She ran her hands quickly over the coat. Along the sleeves, there was something stiff and rectangular under the fur. She stuck her hand inside the sleeve, trying to understand what she was examining. Finally, her fingers made sense of it. She wasn't sure she would have put it together if she hadn't recently cut Kevin out of a batsuit. Einstein pulled another dense bulk of fur down on them. They're lined in Kevlar, she whispered. We should put them on. Alex struggled into hers as she worked through it in her head. The Kevlar made sense, but why the cumbersome fur? Had Kevin trained the dogs during cold weather? Was this just preparation for the elements? Did it even get that cold here? But as she yanked up the arms, too long, of course, to free her hands, she saw how Daniel's coat was blending into Einstein's fur so that she couldn't see where one stopped and the other began. Camouflage. The coat even had a Kevlar-lined hood, which she pulled over her head. Now she and Daniel were just two more furry shapes in the darkness. Einstein went directly through the doggy door at the far end of the laundry room, and Daniel went right after. She could feel Khan's heat close behind her. She got through the door and saw Einstein pulling Daniel back down as he tried to rise into a crouch. Crawl, she explained. It was frustratingly slow. The coat got heavier and hotter with every foot she gained, and the gravel was like knife points under her palms and knees. Once they got into the stubbly grass, it was a little less painful, but she was so impatient with the pace that she barely noticed. She worried, as Einstein led them toward the outbuilding where the dogs lived, that he was trying to take them to the truck that she'd instructed Arnie to move. But the truck wasn't such a great escape. The shooter might be holding his position, just waiting for someone to try to drive out on the only road. Or this could be a new variation, where the shooter had friends to sweep the house and flush his victims out while he waited. She could hear the rest of dogs penned in the outbuilding ahead, none of them happy with what was happening. They'd made it 3/4 of the way when another sharp thud kicked a cloud of dirt into her face. Einstein barked sharply, and Alex heard one of the dogs behind her thunder off from their little pack, growling in a low bass. The heavy sound of his paws combined with his compact stride made her sure it must be the Rottweiler. Another thud, farther out, but the growling didn't change tempo. She heard something, maybe a muffled curse, and then a hail of bullets rattled out from what was most definitely not a sniper rifle. Her muscles tensed, even as she crawled as quickly as she could in Daniel's wake, waiting for the inevitable sound of the Rottweiler's yelps. The sound didn't come, but the growling vanished. Tears pricked her eyes. Khan moved into position at her side, the shooter's side, and she saw Einstein was providing the same protection to Daniel. Kevin had said the dogs would give their lives for Daniel, and they were proving it. It would probably irk Kevin to know they were doing the same for her. Kevin. Well, the odds were now better that he was alive. The news broadcasts hadn't cut off because the agency had found Kevin, but because
and we find
they'd
ourselves
successfully
now on the 12th
located
hole.
Daniel.
Let's see what you can do.
They made the outbuilding. She crawled gratefully into the obscuring dark. The dogs inside were whining and barking anxiously. Fighting the heavy mass of the lined coat, she struggled to her feet, still bent over but able to move faster. Daniel copied her, keeping an eye on Einstein to see if he would insist they get back down. Einstein wasn't paying attention to Daniel at the moment, though. Both he and Khan were doing a stuttering race down the line of kennels, stopping at each door and then bounding to the next.
Okay, you're kind of in
At first,
some deep
she
stuff.
wasn't sure
This
if
is
she
the
was
danger
supposed to
zone.
run too, but then she realized what they were doing. The closest kennels swung open, then the following set. Kevin had taught his prize pupils how to open the kennels from the outside. The freed dogs were immediately silent. The first pair was a matched set of standard German shepherds. The two dogs raced out the barn door, heading north. Before they were out of sight, 3 Rottweilers sprinted past her toward the south. A lone Doberman followed, then another quartet of German shepherds, each group heading in a different direction. The dogs started flooding out of the building so quickly that she lost count entirely. Easily more than 30 animals, though some of them were still very young. Part of her wanted to cheer, "Tear 'em up, boys," while the other part wanted to tell them, "Be careful." She saw Lola's pups run past, and her eyes teared again. In the dark night, someone shouted in panic. Gunfire, then screaming. A tight, mirthless smile stretched her lips. But it wasn't entirely good news. She heard shots from another
back
direction.
On the fairway. Let's see about
Definitely
hitting this
multiple
green,
attackers.
And from here, we're
Gun?
about
She
130
whispered to
yards
Daniel.
out.
He nodded and pulled it out from the waist of his jeans. He offered it to her. She shook her head. She just wanted to know he hadn't dropped it. She was dripping sweat inside the thick fur. She pushed back the hood and wiped her forearm across her forehead. "What now?" he murmured. "Are we supposed to wait here?" She was just about to say that as an escape, this didn't quite answer, when Einstein was back, tugging Daniel down again. She got on her hands and knees and followed as Einstein led them out the door they'd come in. Khan was still there, bringing up the rear again. This time, Einstein led them due north, though she didn't know of any additional structure that way. It was probably going to be a long crawl, she realized, and her hands were already deeply scratched from the dry stalks of grass. She tried to protect her palms with the cuffs of the coat's sleeves, but that part wasn't lined, so it only helped a little. At least there were too many furry shapes in the night for a shooter to bother with 4 that weren't attacking. She looked back toward the house in the distance. She didn't see any new lights on. They hadn't started clearing the house yet. The dog sounds continued, far away growling, the baying of Lola's pups, and random staccato barks.
Sitting at 2 under for the round.
She lost track of time, only aware of the amount of sweat she was producing,
All right, let's
the
pop this in the
rasping
fairway.
sound of her panting, the fact that they'd been going slightly uphill the whole way, and now Daniel was slowing some, and that her palms were being pierced again and again despite the coat. But she didn't think they'd gone very far when Daniel gasped quietly and stopped. She crawled up beside him. It was the fence. They'd reached the northern boundary of the ranch. She looked for Einstein, wondering what they were supposed to do next, and then she realized that Einstein was already on the other side. He looked at her, then pointed his nose down to the bottom edge of the fence. She felt her way along the place he indicated and found that the earth dropped away from the line of chain link. What she'd thought was a shadow was actually a narrow gorge of dark rock. The space was easily
Great
big enough for her to
contact.
slip through. She felt Daniel grab her ankle, using her for guidance. After they were both through, she turned to watch Khan struggle his way into the gorge. She winced, knowing the bottom edge of the chain link must be gouging into his skin. he didn't make any audible complaint. They came out on top of a shallow, rocky ravine. It had been invisible from the house, hidden in the lee of the slight rise of land. She'd never guessed that there was any end to the flat plains stretching north toward Oklahoma. Einstein was already scrambling down the rocks. It looked like he might be on a faint, narrow path. Khan nudged her from behind.
Hope this one bites.
"Let's go," she whispered. She lifted herself into a low crouch,
Nice.
and when Einstein didn't
26-footer from here
object,
to the cup.
started carefully down the slope. She could feel Daniel following closely. There did appear to be a path, though it could have been a game trail, too. There was a new sound in the darkness, a gentle whooshing that it took her a few seconds to place. She hadn't realized the river came so close to the house. It was only about 15 feet to the bottom of the ravine, and when they reached it, Alex felt it was safe to straighten up. The water coursed quietly past them in the dark. She thought she could make out the far side. The river was much narrower here than it was by the barn. Einstein was yanking at something under a ledge, a place where the water had cut away the bank, leaving an overhanging shelf of stone. She went to help and was thrilled to see that it was a small rowboat. She thought she understood the protocol now.
Okay, so that's going to keep you
"I will
at
never
2
say
under
another
for the
bad word
round.
about your brother," she muttered rashly as she helped tow the boat from its hiding
And
place.
now we find ourselves
If Kevin
on
was
hole
still
number
alive,
14.
and if she and Daniel lived through the night, she would no doubt break that promise. But for now, she was filled with gratitude. Daniel caught the other side of the boat and pushed. They had it in the water in seconds, the eddies swirling around their calves. Her coat trailed so much lower to the ground than his that the bottom edge was already in the river. The fur soaked up the
Beauty.
water, getting heavier with each step. The current ran faster than the smooth surface implied, and they had their hands full hanging onto the boat while the dogs jumped in. Khan's weight lowered the stern of the boat dangerously close to the rippling water, so they both piled into the prow next to Einstein. First, Alex, while Daniel held the boat, and then he leapt in next to her. The boat took off like an arrow shot from a bow. She threw off the hot, heavy coat. She'd never be able to swim in it if that became necessary. Daniel followed suit quickly, whether because he'd thought of the same danger or just because he trusted her to do the right thing. The strong current pushed them swiftly westward. Alex had to assume that this was part of the plan, as Kevin hadn't left any oars. About 10 minutes later, the water began to slow as it widened out around a broad bend. Her eyes had adjusted enough for her to make out what she thought was the far edge of the water. The current was pushing them toward the south bank, the same bank they'd started off from.
Just want to save par.
Einstein was anxious in the prow, his ears pointed sharply upward, his muscles stretched taut. She wasn't sure what he was watching for, but when they'd passed some invisible boundary, he suddenly launched from the boat and into the water. It was deep enough that he had to
in
swim,
the hole.
but she couldn't guess how far beneath his churning legs
And
the
that'll
bottom
keep
lay.
you at 2 under for the
He looked
round.
back at them and yelped. Realizing it was probably a good idea to get out before
Okay, here
Khan
we
did,
go.
Alex jumped just a second later. The cool water closed briefly over her head before she surged back to the surface. She heard 2 splashes behind her. First, a small one, then a huge one that sent a wave rolling over her head again. Khan swam past her, the water foaming white around his legs, and found his footing just a second before her toes scuffed against the sandy bottom. She turned to see Daniel fighting with the current
Heading towards
as he
the
tried
beach
to
here.
drag the
Not
wooden
the good
boat
kind.
toward the bank. She knew she couldn't help him if she was in too deep, so she waded downriver and met him when he reached the shallows. She grabbed the prow, and he pulled from the middle, his hand wrapped around the bench. It didn't take long to get to the shore, where the dogs were shaking themselves off. They lugged the boat 10 feet out of the water, then Daniel dropped it and looked at his hands. She did the same. The rough wood hadn't been kind to her already torn palms. They were bleeding freely now, drops of red trickling from the tips of her fingers. Daniel wiped his right hand against his jeans, leaving a bloody streak, then reached back into the boat and retrieved the gun and something smaller, a phone. It must have been Kevin's. Daniel had had the good sense to keep both out of the water. Impressive, given the shock and pressure they were both under. Luckily, everything non-waterproof in her backpack was carefully ziplocked. She
Okay, you are
examined his face quickly.
deep in the rough here.
He didn't look like he was going to break down, but there might not be much warning. Daniel grabbed the coats and held them awkwardly bundled in both arms. She was about to tell him to leave them, but then she realized that there was going to be a murder investigation in the near future. Better to hide what evidence they could. "Put them in the river. The boat, too," she whispered. "We don't want anyone to find either." Without hesitation, he hurried back to the edge of the water and dropped the coats into the current. Heavy as they were, it didn't take long for them to saturate and disappear
Great
under the
contact.
surface.
Nice swing.
Alex started shoving the boat, and Daniel joined her, pulling it downhill. In seconds, it was racing off across the dark water. She knew it was marked with their blood and prints, but hopefully it would travel far enough tonight that no one would connect it with Kevin's house in the morning. The boat looked old and weathered, certainly not valuable. Perhaps the people who found it would consider it trash and treat it accordingly. Alex imagined Kevin and Einstein on the red water in the daylight, running the route for practice. They must have tried it many times. Kevin would probably be upset about her losing his boat, regardless of the value. She and Daniel turned back toward land together. The barn was easy to see, the only tall shape in the flat darkness.
Okay, so
As they
that's going
ran
to keep
toward
you
it,
at
a
2
solid
under for the
square
round.
being suddenly reared up. Alex startled, expecting the dogs to
16th hole
react.
coming up here.
Then her
Let us
eyes made
see what you
sense
can
of the
do.
shape. It was one of the firing range haystacks. She took a deep breath to settle herself and ran on. They reached the barn and then raced around to the front doors. Daniel's longer legs got him there first, and he already had the lock free when she caught up to him. He yanked the door out of the way, waited for her and the dogs to get inside, then shut it behind them. It was pitch black. "Give me a sec," Daniel whispered. She could barely hear his movement over the sound of her own heartbeat and the panting of the dogs. There was a tinny creak, and then a quiet metallic groan.
Now that was a swing.
A faint green light glowed to her right. She could just make out Daniel's shape. His hand lit up as he touched a glowing keypad. Suddenly, brighter white light burst
Looks
through a
like,
long line beside him.
I'd say around 110
As he yanked the
yards
crevice
or so to the
open
pin.
and more light flooded the space, she saw what he was doing. He was at one of the old cars on blocks. He'd opened the fake battery, entered his birthday code, and the false engine had opened. It was the stash of rifles, illuminated from the inside. "Put some of those in the Humvee," she whispered to Daniel. The low volume was probably unnecessary, but she couldn't make herself speak louder. The light was enough to brighten a space about 15 feet around him in every direction. The two dogs stood by the door, facing out as if expecting intruders, waiting and panting. Alex sprinted to her duffels and threw off the old tarp. She unzipped the side of the bottom bag and grabbed a pair of latex gloves. She pulled them over her bleeding hands. She took a second pair and stuffed them halfway into her front jeans pocket. When she turned, Daniel had already moved on to the hollow tractor tire. He had 2 rifles slung over his back, and cradled in his arm were 2 Glocks and the shotgun she'd been wishing for. As she watched, he reached for the Sig Sauer he'd seen her practice
9-footer
with.
here. See what we can do.
He might be new to her world, but his instincts seemed up to the task. It took her 2 trips to get her bags into the vehicle hidden behind the hay bales. On the first trip, she gave Daniel the gloves as they passed each other. He put them on without asking for an explanation. She was happy to see the Humvee's interior lights had been disengaged. After her stuff was in, she loaded the grenades, but chose to leave the rocket launchers behind. She wasn't sure she could figure out how to use them without blowing herself up. "The cash?" Daniel asked when she passed him. "Yes, all of it."
Okay, 1 under for the
He
round.
moved quickly in response, and for one crazy second, she had a sense of déjà vu.
All right.
They worked
Let's
well
let
together,
her rip.
just like doing dishes. There was a supply of Kevlar. She put a vest on and tightened the straps as far as they would go, but it still hung a little loose. It wasn't unbearably heavy, so she guessed it had ceramic plates. She pulled another for Daniel. There were a couple of Batman wetsuits, but they were too big for her and would probably take too long for Daniel to struggle into. She smiled when she found 2 thick baseball caps. She'd heard about these, but thought only the Secret Service used them.
Looking good.
She stuck one on her head and took the other to Daniel along with the vest. He put both on silently, his face determined and pale. She wondered how long he could hold it together. Hopefully, the natural adrenaline would last until they got out of this. She strapped a long, thin blade to her thigh, wrapped a holster belt under her usual leather utility, then slung another over her shoulders. She went to the back of the Humvee. She took one of the Glocks and put it on her right hip. She put the SIG under one arm and her PPK under the other. Then she holstered the sawed-off shotgun on her left hip. Ammo? He nodded. He'd left his favorite rifle slung over one shoulder. She jerked her chin toward it. Keep that on you, and take a handgun too. He picked up the other Glock and gripped it in his gloved hand.
Holy.
We need to wipe
Awesome.
down everything you touched. Before she
2
was
under for
finished
the
speaking,
round.
he was in motion. He grabbed the tarp that had hidden her bags and tore off 2 long strips.
Nice solid birdie on that
He threw
last
her one
hole. We got
and went
another
out to the
birdie in the
lock,
works here.
Einstein shadowing him. She started on the first car he'd opened. It didn't take them long to get everything. There was blood on the pieces of tarp, so she stuffed them into the back of the Humvee too. She stopped to listen for a moment. Nothing but 4 nervous animals breathing. Where do we go now? Daniel asked. His voice was strained and more inflectionless than usual, but he sounded in control. Your place up north? She knew her expression was hard, and possibly frightening, as she told him,
Unlucky.
Not
Unlucky.
yet.
Pretty deep stuff here. Give it a good hack. Let's put it in
Chapter
the right
18.
direction.
You're going back, he said in a hollow whisper. She nodded. Do you think Arnie might still be? No, he's dead. Daniel's body swayed ever so slightly in reaction to the cold certainty of her words. Then shouldn't we be running? You told me if they come for us, we run. He was right, and it was also her nature to run. She wondered if this was the feeling those mothers had, the ones you read about in the news who lifted the minivan off their child. Desperate, terrified, but also as powerful as a superhero. Alex had her way of doing things. Plan, 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 for every possibility. And then when disaster hit, execute the plan that was the
I think
best
you'll
fit.
be 2-putting from here.
She
Okay,
did
let's
not
see what
do
you can do
spur
with
of
his
the moment.
8-footer.
She did not do instinct. She did not do fight. She did flight. But she didn't just have herself to protect tonight. She had a minivan to lift. There was no plan, only instinct. Her instinct was that a serious attack was happening, a well-coordinated one, organized by people who had more intel than they should have. She and Daniel could run, but who knew what else the hunters had set up? There could be another trap. If she could find out who they were and what they knew, her escape with Daniel had a much better chance of success. Finding things out was her specialty, after all. Attacking was not. But that just meant it would not be expected.
Nice.
Hell, she was more than a little surprised herself. The hunters didn't know about the Batcave,
3 under
or they would
out
have
there
been
today
waiting
on
for
the
her